All right, fellow medical microbiologists, let's dive into the world of Listeria and Erysipelothrix.
Two bacterial genera that can really pack a punch.
Exactly. And for this deep dive, we'll be using the second edition of Principles and Practice of Clinical Bacteriology by Gillespie and Hockey.
An excellent resource for anyone working in the field.
Absolutely. So let's start by getting to know these microscopic troublemakers.
Sounds good.
Okay, Listeria, especially the Listeria monocytogenes, are known to be incredibly hardy.
Oh, they are survivors, thriving in places where most bacteria wouldn't stand a chance.
Seriously.
Oh,
Soil, water, and even
wait for it.
the inside of your refrigerator.
It's true, they can grow at temperatures as low as 0 degrees C.
So even in the fridge,
Multiplying away.
that's why there's such a concern for food safety.
Oh, absolutely. A major cause of foodborne illness outbreaks.
And we've got two main players to keep in mind.
Right. Listeria monocytogenes is the one we see most often in human infections.
The main culprit,
But Listeria venovi can also cause problems.
so much less common.
Yes, definitely less common.
So Listeria monocytogenes is definitely the one we need to be most aware of.
For sure.
Now, I read that it produces these proteins called internalins,
Ah, yes, internalins.
and these help them to invade our cells.
Clever little things, aren't they?
It's like a Trojan horse situation.
Precisely. They attach to our cells.
And slip right in.
Undetected.
So they've breached our defenses.
Exactly.
What happens next?
Well, once inside, they've got another trick up their sleeve.
What's that?
A toxin called Listeria O.
Okay, and this does...
This is their weapon. It lets them escape from the cell's defenses and roam free.
Oh, wow.
But it gets even more impressive.
How so?
They hijack the cell's own machinery.
No way.
Oh, yes, they use the actin filaments,
Flochar?
part of the cell's skeleton, to move around.
So they're not only surviving inside our cells.
They're using them for transportation.
That is incredible.
Pollution at its finest.
Now on to Erysipelothrix rhusiopathiae.
A bit of a shapeshifter, this one.
How so?
It can appear as rods, chains, or even filaments.
Interesting.
But unlike Listeria, it's mainly found in animals.
Right, especially pigs,
Yes, pigs are the primary reservoir.
causing swine erysipelas.
Exactly.
But humans can get infected too, right?
Yes, although it's less common,
How is it typically transmitted?
usually through direct contact with infected animals or contaminated animal products.
So certain occupations are more at risk.
Absolutely. Veterinarians, butchers, anyone working with animals, really.
Makes sense.
So we've got Listeria as a food safety concern.
And Erysipelothrix as a zoonotic threat.
That's right.
But how do they actually cause harm?
Well, we talked about internalins and Listeria O for Listeria.
Right, those are key virulence factors.
Exactly. But for Erysipelothrix rhusiopathiae, it's a bit more of a mystery.
Really?
We're still figuring out the exact mechanisms,
Interesting.
but its ability to survive inside phagocytes seems to be important.
Phagocytes being.
Our immune cells, the ones that are supposed to destroy invading bacteria.
So it's evading our immune system.
Exactly, playing hide and seek with our defenses.
Now let's talk about what happens when these bacteria actually infect humans.
The clinical feature.
Exactly. What should clinicians be looking out for?
Well, with Listeria infections, the picture can be quite varied.
In what way?
Some people might experience mild flu-like symptoms,
Okay, so not too serious.
but others, particularly pregnant women, newborns, and those with weakened immune system.
They're more vulnerable.
Exactly. They can develop much more serious complications.
Like,
Meningitis, sepsis.
those are serious.
Very serious.
And why are pregnant women and newborns so susceptible?
Well, one of the big concerns with Listeria is its ability to cross the placenta.
Meaning,
It can infect the developing fetus,
breathing too.
miscarriage, stillbirth, or serious health problems for the newborn.
That's really concerning.
It is a serious concern.
What about newborns? What happens if they get infected?
Well, Listeria infection in newborns can take two forms:
Okay, what are they?
early onset and late onset.
And the difference is?
Early onset happens within the first few days of life,
Okay,
usually due to transmission from the mother during pregnancy or childbirth,
I see.
and it often presents as a severe sepsis,
Sepsis being.
a life-threatening inflammatory response that can affect multiple organ systems.
So those first few days are critical.
Absolutely. Babies are so vulnerable at that stage.
Their immune systems are still developing.
Exactly. Now, late onset listeriosis, as the name suggests,
Develops later.
yes, typically a week or more after birth.
And what causes that delay?
It's usually due to exposure to Listeria after birth.
From the environment, maybe.
Exactly, contaminated environments or contact with infected individuals.
So different mode of transmission, different timing.
And often a different clinical presentation as well.
Interesting. Tell me more.
The most common manifestation of late-onset listeriosis is meningitis.
Meningitis, that's
Inflammation of the membranes surrounding the brain and spinal cord.
a serious condition. So two distinct presentations in newborns.
Yeah.
Early onset sepsis and late onset meningitis.
That's right. Important for clinicians to be aware of.
Now, let's talk about Listeria infections in adults.
Okay.
I read that healthy adults are less likely to develop serious listeriosis.
That's generally true.
Why is that?
Well, in healthy adults, Listeria infection often manifests as a self-limiting gastroenteritis.
Meaning
Symptoms like fever, diarrhea, abdominal cramps.
unpleasant, but not life-threatening.
Exactly. It usually resolves on its own without any lasting problem.
Though for most healthy adults, it's not a major threat.
Right.
But there are exceptions.
Where there are always exceptions.
Okay.
Individuals with weakened immune systems.
They're much more vulnerable.
Absolutely. Much higher risk of developing serious invasive listeriosis.
What kind of things can weaken the immune system?
Lots of things. HIV/AIDS, cancer, diabetes, organ transplantation, certain medications like chemotherapy or immunosuppressants.
So it's not just about age, it's about overall health. And for those with weakened immune systems, Listeria infection can be much more serious.
It can spread beyond the gastrointestinal tract.
Can cause
Meningitis, sepsis, endocarditis.
endocarditis. We've heard that before.
It's a potential complication for both Listeria and Erysipelothrix.
Really? Both can infect the heart valves,
They can.
leading to serious problems.
It's a reminder that even though these infections are relatively rare,
They can have serious consequences.
if they're not recognized and treated properly.
So let's talk about Erysipelothrix infections in humans.
Okay.
We've mentioned erysipeloid.
The distinctive skin infection?
Right. But are there other presentations?
Well, erysipeloid is definitely the most common.
Like the vast majority of cases.
The vast majority.
Now, what does it look like?
Usually a well-defined, slightly raised, reddish or purplish lesion.
Where does it typically appear?
Most often on the hands or fingers.
Okay, so pretty characteristic.
Is
it painful?
It can be, people often describe it as itchy or burning.
And sometimes painful.
Sometimes.
Any other symptoms?
Not usually. Erysipeloid is usually a localized skin infection.
So no fever or anything like that?
Systemic symptoms are uncommon.
Good to know.
Now, while erysipeloid is the most common presentation,
Right.
there are rare cases of more invasive Erysipelothrix infections.
Okay.
Endocarditis, sepsis, arthritis.
Endocarditis again.
Yes, it's a shared potential complication.
Important to catch these infections early then.
Absolutely. Early diagnosis and treatment are key to preventing those more serious outcomes.
Which brings us to treatment.
The all-important question of how we manage these infections.
We know antibiotics are the mainstay of therapy,
They are.
but I'm curious about the specifics.
Okay, what would you like to know?
Well, what are some of the challenges clinicians face when treating Listeria infections?
One of the biggest challenges with Listeria is its intracellular lifestyle.
Meaning?
Remember, it can survive and replicate inside our cells.
Right.
So the antibiotics we choose need to be able to get inside those cells to reach the bacteria.
I see. So it's not just about picking an antibiotic that works against Listeria in a lab test.
Exactly. We need to think about how well it penetrates into our cells.
Makes sense.
Another challenge is the potential for drug resistance.
Is that a growing problem with Listeria?
Well, Listeria is generally susceptible to the antibiotics we use,
Okay.
but there have been reports of resistance,
To which antibiotics?
particularly to certain classes, like tetracyclines.
So we need to stay vigilant.
Absolutely. Monitor for resistance patterns and choose antibiotics carefully.
What about treatment for Erysipelothrix?
That's usually more straightforward.
How so?
Penicillin is the go-to antibiotic.
Really?
It's highly effective against Erysipelothrix.
That's good to know.
The important thing is to check for any penicillin allergies before starting treatment.
Of course.
If penicillin isn't an option, there are alternatives. Cephalosporins or fluoroquinolones.
Okay, so we've got options.
We do. And fortunately, Erysipelothrix is generally quite susceptible to a range of antibiotics.
That's reassuring. Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground today.
We have. From the basics of these bacteria to some of the clinical challenges they present.
It's been a fascinating journey so far.
I agree, and I'm sure our listeners are eager to test their knowledge.
Well, you're in luck. In our next segment, We'll be putting your Listeria and Erysipelothrix knowledge to the test with a few exam-style questions.
Sounds fun. I'm ready to see what they've learned.
Excellent. We'll be back after a short break. Welcome back, everyone. Now, before the break, we were talking about where these bacteria hang out and how they spread.
Their epidemiology.
Exactly. Let's start with Listeria. We know it can contaminate food.
Right, but it's actually found in all sorts of environments.
Like where?
Soil, water, sewage, decaying vegetation, really all over the place.
Wow. So it's not just lurking in our kitchens.
Not at all. It's out there in the world just waiting for a chance to make its way into our food supply.
Then how does that happen?
Well, as we discussed, food contamination is a major route of transmission.
Right, especially for those ready-to-eat foods.
Exactly. The ones that don't go through any further cooking before we eat them.
No kill step.
Exactly. That's why things like deli meats and hot dogs can be a concern.
And fresh produce, too.
Oh, absolutely. We've seen outbreaks linked to things like cantaloupes, lettuce, even pre-packaged salads.
So it's not just about avoiding raw meat and unpasteurized dairy.
Nope. Listeria can be sneaky.
It sounds like we need to be careful about all sorts of foods.
We do. Washing and handling fruits and vegetables properly is really important.
And making sure those deli meats are heated thoroughly.
Exactly. It's a multi-pronged approach.
From production to processing to our own kitchens.
Food safety is everyone's responsibility.
Now, what about Erysipelothrix? We know it's mainly found in animals.
Pigs being the primary reservoir.
Right, but our source mentioned that it's been found in other animals, too.
Yes, it has sheep, cattle, poultry.
And even in marine environments.
Believe it or not, yes. Fish and crustaceans.
So it's not just a pig problem.
Not exclusively. Anyone handling animals or animal products could be at risk.
Veterinarians, butchers, farmers, fishermen.
The list goes on.
So again, awareness is key.
Absolutely. Knowing the risks and taking precautions.
Now, I'm curious about how common these infections actually are in humans.
That's a good question. It's tough to get precise numbers.
Why is that?
Well, reporting of these infections isn't always consistent.
I see.
Mild cases, especially of listeriosis, might go undiagnosed or unreported.
Makes sense. People might just think they have a stomach bug.
Exactly. And for Erysipelothrix, those mild skin infections...
People might not even see a doctor.
Right. They might just treat it at home.
So the data we have might not tell the whole story.
Exactly. But from what we do know, both infections are considered relatively rare.
In the general population?
Yes. But as we discussed, certain groups are more vulnerable.
Pregnant women, newborns, people with weakened immune systems.
For Listeria, yes.
And for Erysipelothrix.
Those who work with animals.
Right. They have a higher risk of exposure.
Makes sense.
Now, I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier.
What's
the challenges of diagnosing these infections in the lab?
Yes. We talked about the importance of culturing.
Right. But there are some potential pitfalls.
There are. What are you thinking of?
Well, for example, with Listeria.
It can be a bit of a mimic.
Meaning?
It can resemble other bacteria, like diphtheroids.
Which are?
Common contaminants in lab cultures.
So we could mistake Listeria for something harmless?
It's possible if we're not careful.
And miss the diagnosis completely.
Exactly. That's why it's so important to pay attention to its specific characteristics.
Like what?
Its unusual motility pattern, for example.
Tell me more about that.
Well, Listeria is motile at 20 degrees C, but not at 37 degrees C.
Interesting. And that helps us to distinguish it from other bacteria.
It does. It's a clue that we shouldn't ignore.
Anything else?
Well, its hemolysis on blood agar is also distinctive.
The beta hemolysis we talked about earlier.
Exactly. These are the things that should make us stop and think, hey, this could be Listeria.
So we need to be meticulous.
Absolutely. Careful observation is crucial.
Now, what about Erysipelothrix? Any diagnostic challenges there?
Well, one challenge is that it can be slow growing.
So it takes longer to culture?
It can. We need to be patient and give it time.
Otherwise, we might miss it.
Exactly. And it can also be mistaken for other gram-positive rods,
like
lactobacilli or corynebacteria.
So again, knowing its unique features is key.
Absolutely. Yeah. We need to be able to differentiate it from those lookalikes.
It sounds like diagnosing these infections requires a sharp eye and a solid understanding of their quirks.
It does. But that's part of what makes medical microbiology so fascinating.
I agree. Now that we've covered the lab side of things.
Let's talk about what happens when these bacteria actually make us sick.
The clinical features.
Exactly. How do these infections actually present in patients?
That's what we'll be discussing after a quick break. Back in a flash.
Welcome back, everyone. So before the break, we were talking about the lab diagnosis of Listeria and Erysipelothrix.
Those tricky little bacteria. They can be. Now let's dive into the clinical side of things. How do these infections actually present in patients?
Let's start with Listeria.
Okay, good place to start.
One of the most concerning aspects of Listeria infection is its impact on pregnancy.
We touched on that earlier.
Right, listeriosis during pregnancy can be really serious.
What are the typical symptoms?
Well, it often starts off like a flu-like illness.
Okay, so fever, headache, muscle aches.
Exactly, those kinds of things.
But that could be easily mistaken for something else, right?
That's the problem. It can be tricky to diagnose early on.
Especially if the symptoms are mild.
And some pregnant women might not have any symptoms at all.
Asymptomatic.
Yes, but even without symptoms, the infection can be causing serious harm to the fetus.
We've talked about Listeria's ability to cross the placenta.
Right, it can lead to miscarriage, stillbirth, premature birth, or serious health issues for the newborn.
A sobering reminder of the risks involved.
It is. Now in newborns, Listeria infection can manifest in two distinct forms.
Oh, tell me more about that.
We have early onset neonatal listeriosis
Okay.
and late onset listeriosis.
And the difference is?
Early onset occurs within the first few days of life.
So very soon after birth.
Exactly. And it's usually due to transmission from the mother during pregnancy or childbirth.
I see.
And it typically presents as a severe sepsis,
That's the...
life-threatening inflammatory response.
Right, which can affect multiple organ systems.
Exactly.
So those first few days are really critical.
Absolutely. Babies are so vulnerable at that stage.
Where immune systems are still immature.
Exactly. Now, late onset listeriosis,
As the name suggests.
develops later, usually a week or more after birth.
And what causes that delayed onset?
It's usually associated with exposure to Listeria after birth.
So not from the mother.
Not in this case. It could be from contaminated environments or contact with infected individuals.
Interesting. So different timing, different mode of transmission.
And often a different clinical presentation as well.
Really? How so?
The most common manifestation of late-onset listeriosis is meningitis.
Meningitis being...
Inflammation of the membranes surrounding the brain and spinal cord.
Right, a serious condition.
Absolutely.
So early onset listeriosis usually presents as sepsis.
Yes.
And late onset listeriosis is more likely to be meningitis.
That's the general pattern.
Important for clinicians to be aware of that distinction.
It is. Now let's shift our focus to adults.
Okay, Listeria infections in adults.
We mentioned earlier that healthy adults are less likely to develop serious listeriosis.
Right, because their immune systems are stronger.
Exactly. In healthy adults, Listeria infection often manifests as a self-limiting gastroenteritis.
Meaning?
They might have fever, diarrhea, abdominal cramps.
The usual stomach bug symptoms.
Pretty much. But it usually resolves on its own without any lasting problems.
So not a major threat for most healthy adults.
Right. But, as always, there are exceptions.
And those exceptions would be?
Individuals with weakened immune systems.
Right. They're more vulnerable to those serious complications.
Exactly. And those complications can include meningitis, sepsis, and endocarditis.
We keep coming back to endocarditis.
It's a common thread for both Listeria and Erysipelothrix.
Both can infect the heart valves,
They can.
leading to potentially life-threatening consequences.
It's a reminder that we can't take these infections lightly.
Now let's talk about the clinical features of Erysipelothrix infections.
Okay, so as we mentioned before, the most common presentation is erysipeloid.
That distinctive skin infection.
Exactly. It usually appears as a well-defined, slightly raised lesion,
And the color.
reddish or purplish.
Okay, and where does it usually show up?
Most often on the hands or fingers.
So pretty characteristic.
It is, and it can be quite uncomfortable.
In what way?
Itchy, burning, sometimes painful.
So not something you would ignore.
Right, it usually gets people's attention.
Any other symptoms besides the skin lesion?
Not usually. Erysipeloid is typically a localized skin infection.
So no fever or other systemic symptoms.
Uncommon in most cases.
Good to know. Now, we've talked about erysipeloid being the most frequent presentation,
Right.
but there are those rare cases of more invasive Erysipelothrix infections.
There are.
What are some of those?
Well, things like endocarditis, sepsis, or arthritis.
Endocarditis again.
It's a shared potential complication.
So both Listeria and Erysipelothrix can cause endocarditis,
They can.
which reinforces the importance of early diagnosis and treatment.
Absolutely. We want to prevent those serious complications whenever possible.
So let's talk about treatment. What are the options?
Well, for both Listeria and Erysipelothrix,
Okay.
antibiotics are the mainstay of therapy.
Makes sense. But are there any specific challenges when it comes to treating Listeria?
Yes, there are. Remember that Listeria can survive inside our cells.
Right, that intracellular lifestyle.
Exactly. So the antibiotics we choose need to be able to penetrate those cells to reach the bacteria.
So it's not just about finding an antibiotic that kills Listeria in a petri dish.
Right. We need to think about how well it gets to where the bacteria are actually hiding.
Makes sense.
And we also need to be mindful of drug resistance.
Is that a big problem with Listeria?
Well, it's not widespread, but there have been reports of resistance.
To which antibiotics?
Particularly to certain classes, like tetracyclines.
So we need to be careful.
Absolutely. Choose antibiotics wisely and monitor for any signs of resistance.
Now, what about treatment for Erysipelothrix?
That's usually more straightforward.
How so?
Penicillin is the go-to antibiotic for Erysipelothrix.
Really?
It's highly effective.
That's good news.
It is. But of course, we always need to check for any penicillin allergies before starting treatment.
Of course.
If penicillin isn't an option, there are alternatives.
Such as?
Cephalosporins or fluoroquinolones.
Okay, so we have backup plans.
We do. And the good news is that Erysipelothrix is generally quite susceptible to a range of antibiotics.
That's reassuring.
It is.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground today.
We have. We've explored the world of Listeria and Erysipelothrix, from their microscopic features to their clinical presentations and treatment options.
It's been a fascinating journey. And we've learned that these two bacterial genera, while relatively uncommon,
Can cause a range of infections.
from mild skin infections to life-threatening complications.
And that accurate diagnosis and prompt treatment are essential.
Absolutely. So to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the world of Listeria and Erysipelothrix.
We hope you found it informative and engaging.
And remember, stay curious, keep learning, and always be on the lookout for those microscopic wonders that shape our world.
Until next time.